I arrived 15 minutes early because I wanted to see his face when he walked in and found me already seated. I had chosen the restaurant weeks in advance, the one he always described as, where deals are closed. I thought it would be poetic to reclaim it for something softer. The hostess smiled when I gave his name. "Your table is ready," she said. "Our table." I adjusted my coat, smoothing the fabric of the dress I'd bought specifically for that night. In my bag was a small box heavier than it looked. Inside it, the watch I'd ordered with a private engraving, "For everything we built." I stepped into the dining room and saw him before he saw me. He wasn't at our table. He was in the center of the room under the warm chandelier light, down on one knee in front of her. Isio. The room was quiet in that anticipatory way that feels rehearsed. A few diners already had their phones raised. The ring in his hand caught the light as he spoke words I couldn't fully hear, only fragments. Future together. Partnership beyond business. Applause broke out before she even answered. I stood there invisible, holding the strap of my bag so tightly my fingers ached. The hostess looked from him to me and back again, confusion flickering across her face. He slid the ring onto her finger. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see. What he didn't know was that I had already signed something too. Before that night, before the ring and the applause, there had been years of quiet investment. When he was accepted into his MBA program, he framed the acceptance letter like it was a shared victory. We celebrated with takeout on the living room floor because we couldn't afford anything more elaborate. I told him we would make it work. And we did. I picked up extra consulting contracts after my regular job. I stayed late at the office, billing hours that blurred into weekends. I paid the rent, the utilities, the insurance. When tuition invoices arrived, we reviewed them together at the kitchen table, and I transferred the funds from my savings account without hesitation. "We're investing in our future," he would say, squeezing my hand. I believed him. While he attended networking events and late study sessions, I learned to fall asleep alone. I budgeted groceries down to the dollar. I postponed vacations and delayed replacing things that needed replacing. When his classmates' spouses asked what he did, they spoke about ambition and drive. When they asked what I did, I answered simply and moved the conversation back to him. The first promotion came with a small bonus and a larger shift in tone. He began traveling more. He upgraded his suits. He spoke about strategy, leverage, positioning. I kept speaking about stability. When he launched his first independent venture within the company, it required seed capital. We used our joint savings. I signed as guarantor on a business line of credit because my credit score was stronger. He thanked me, kissed my forehead, and repeated the phrase that had become our anthem. "We're investing in our future." It sounded noble. It sounded mutual. But looking back, I see how carefully the language evolved. The "we" became softer over time, less pronounced. The achievements were framed in singular terms. The risks, however, remained shared. I didn't resent the sacrifice. I resented that it slowly disappeared from the narrative. Because while he was building a resume, I was building the foundation beneath it. And foundations rarely get named. If I am honest, the proposal wasn't the first betrayal. It was only the first undeniable one. The changes began gradually, disguised as professional growth. Late nights became routine. Dinners that were once shared shifted into client obligations. His calendar filled with conferences, leadership retreats, and strategy sessions that always seemed to include her. "She's mentoring me," he said the first time I asked about the frequency of their travel. "This is how advancement works." I wanted to be the kind of wife who understood ambition. So I adjusted. Then came the phone. It used to lie face up on the kitchen counter. Then it started living in his pocket. Notifications were silenced. Passwords changed. When it vibrated late at night, he stepped into the hallway before answering. "It's confidential," he would say when I raised an eyebrow. "You know how corporate politics are." I did. What I didn't know was why confidentiality required emotional distance. Conversations grew shorter. When I mentioned feeling disconnected, he tilted his head slightly as if my concern were an overreaction. "You're imagining tension because you're not busy enough," he said once, not cruelly but dismissively. "You need a project." Project? I had been his project for years. I tried to recalibrate myself. I blamed stress, corporate pressure, the demands of leadership. I reminded myself of the sacrifices we had both made. of the phrases we repeated like doctrine. We're investing in our future. Every time doubt surfaced, I layered logic over it. Success changes schedules. Responsibility reshapes intimacy. I told myself I was mature enough to handle it. But there is a specific kind of silence that forms when something is wrong. It isn't loud. It's evasive. And I ignored it long enough to let it grow. I spent the entire afternoon rehearsing the version of the evening I believed was still possible. I left work early telling my team I had plans. I stopped by the boutique where I'd seen the dress in the window 2 weeks before. Deep red, structured at the waist, understated but deliberate. He once told me that red made me look certain. I wanted to look certain. At home, I laid the dress across the bed and opened the small navy box beside it. The watch gleamed under the lamplight. I turned it over and traced the engraving with my thumb. For everything we built. I had chosen the words carefully. Not romantic cliches. Not dramatic promises. Just acknowledgement. Structure. Partnership. While I did my makeup, I imagined the look on his face when he realized I had made the reservation at his favorite restaurant. The one he associated with contracts and promotions. I liked the symmetry of reclaiming it for something personal. I texted him that I had a late client meeting so he wouldn't expect me home. He replied with a brief "busy tonight too. Big dinner." I smiled at the coincidence, assuming he meant work. I slipped the watch into my bag, feeling its weight settle against the lining. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful. Practical. Like us. On the drive there, I allowed myself a small optimism. The last few months had been tense, but I believed tension could be recalibrated. That ambition and marriage didn't have to compete. The restaurant lights were warm when I arrived. The hostess greeted me by his name, confirming the reservation. Our table. I stepped inside, holding the evening in my mind like something fragile and intact. I didn't yet understand that the illusion wasn't about romance. It was about who believed they were still part of the future being negotiated. He didn't look nervous. That was the detail that stayed with me. If this had been impulsive or reckless, I might have seen hesitation. But his posture was steady, almost practiced. The ring was held at the exact angle where the chandelier light would catch it. The words he spoke were measured deliberately. "I've never met someone who understands vision the way you do," he said, looking up at her as though the room did not exist. "You've challenged me, pushed me, built something with me that goes beyond titles." Built something. The phrase struck me with strange familiarity. "You're not just my leader," he continued. "You're my partner in growth. In ambition. In everything that comes next." Everything that comes next. A few people at nearby tables exchanged smiles, leaning closer to witness the performance. A server paused mid-step. Someone whispered, "How romantic." Romantic. She covered her mouth with her hand, perfectly composed in surprise. There was no confusion in her expression, only recognition. As if the script had been rehearsed privately before being performed publicly. He opened the ring box, fully presenting it not as a question but as a conclusion. "I want to build my life with you." There it was. The sentence that ends one story and begins another. Applause erupted before she answered. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough to seal the moment. She nodded almost professionally and extended her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger with a confidence that suggested inevitability. I stood a few feet away, unnoticed, the watch in my bag pressing against my side like a reminder of a parallel reality that no longer existed. No one in that room knew I was his wife. No one knew the years that preceded this performance. They saw a rising executive claiming his future. They did not see the structure beneath it. I did not step forward. I did not interrupt. I watched. Because in that instant I understood that reacting emotionally would only validate the narrative he had already chosen. And I was not going to become the footnote in his proposal. I did not wait for the applause to fade. I turned and walked back through the entrance with the same measured steps I had used to arrive. The hostess began to say something, then stopped when she saw my expression. Outside, the night air felt sharper, almost metallic. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. My breathing was controlled. The absence of tears surprised me. When I reached home, I placed my bag on the kitchen counter and removed the watch from its box. I set it down beside the sink as if it were simply another object in the house. Then I opened my laptop. If he had chosen spectacle, I would choose structure. I began with our joint accounts. Transfers, deposits, automatic payments. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Then I filtered by larger transactions. Tuition payments. Business development expenses. Consulting fees routed through shared funds. I pulled up the documents from the year he launched his internal corporate initiative. The capital injection he often described as personal risk. The line of credit tied to our apartment. My name listed as guarantor. I leaned back in my chair. The company presentation slide spoke of innovation and independence. The financial filings told a different story. My income had stabilized his early risk. My credit had secured his first expansion. My savings had absorbed his early losses. I opened the folder labeled Assets and began printing copies. Loan agreements. Equity allocations. Insurance policies. My signature appeared repeatedly. He had built an empire on language growth leadership vision. But the foundation beneath it was quieter. And it carried my name. The more I reviewed the numbers, the clearer the pattern became. The first business loan he secured was backed by a joint account we had opened 2 years earlier. At the time he called it temporary leverage. Called it trust. My income statements were attached to the application. My credit score strengthened the approval. My signature authorized the risk. The second expansion round was partially funded by what he described publicly as personal capital. In reality, it came from a savings account that held bonuses from my own consulting contracts. The transfer had been clean, legal, but shared. He had always framed his success as individual ascent. The documents told a more complicated truth. Every time he spoke about taking bold risks, there was a quiet line beneath it secured by her. I found equity documents assigning shares solely to his name. Yet the financing that enabled those shares was intertwined with our marital assets. If the company grew, he stood at the forefront. If it faltered, the exposure would reach me. That was the leverage. Not emotional leverage. Structural leverage. I ran a quick projection tracing liability scenarios if the company faced litigation or financial downturn. My assets were not peripheral. They were foundational. He had proposed to his CEO believing he stood independently. What he didn't know was that the scaffolding beneath him was legally traceable. And traceable meant negotiable. For the first time since the restaurant, I felt something steady beneath the shock. Not revenge. Position. He had chosen visibility. I would choose documentation. Because ambition may be public, but liability is precise. And precision, unlike romance, doesn't disappear under applause. I did not call him. I called an attorney. Not someone recommended by friends, not someone casual. A firm known for corporate restructuring and marital asset litigation. I scheduled the consultation under my maiden name. When I sat across from her, I placed the folder on her desk without dramatics. Loan agreements. Equity assignments. Bank transfers. Insurance declarations. She read in silence, occasionally marking a page with a small adhesive tab. "You understand this gives you leverage," she said finally. "I understand it gives me clarity," I replied. We reviewed our prenuptial agreement. It had seemed thorough at the time, clear division of premarital assets, basic clauses protecting independent income streams. What it did not anticipate was joint financial exposure tied to a corporate entity that later concentrated ownership in one spouse's name. That omission mattered. She explained the difference between title and liability, between public ownership and financial traceability, between appearing independent and being structurally supported. "You are not just emotionally entangled," she said. "You are financially embedded." Embedded. The word felt accurate. We outlined scenarios. Asset freeze. Equity renegotiation. Controlled disclosure. She advised caution, not escalation. "You don't confront," she said. "You present." That distinction anchored me. I returned home and organized the documents chronologically. I highlighted dates, amounts, signatures. I created a clean summary sheet outlining contributions and exposure percentages. There was no anger in the process, only order. If he had believed the proposal marked a new beginning, he would soon learn that beginnings require clean exits. And ours was far from clean. For the first time since the restaurant, anticipation replaced shock. Not of conflict, of correction. I sent him a message the next morning. "We need to talk. At your office." Tomorrow at 9. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He simply replied, okay. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with the familiarity reserved for someone who once belonged. I noticed how quickly she masked her curiosity. News travels fast in executive circles. His office door was closed. I knocked once and entered without waiting. He stood behind his desk, posture controlled, expression neutral. The framed photograph of him and his CEO at a recent conference sat angled on the shelf behind him. You look composed, he said carefully. So do you, I replied. I set my bag on the desk and removed 2 items. First, the engraved watch. I placed it gently on the polished surface between us. Then the folder. He glanced at the watch, then at me. I was going to call you, he began. You did, I said evenly. At the restaurant. Silence. He straightened slightly. This isn't what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. I opened the folder and slid the first set of documents toward him. Highlighted sections. My signature visible on every page. Before we discuss anything else, I said, we need to clarify structure. His brow tightened. Structure. I invested in your future, I said. Now we're revising the terms. He leaned forward, scanning the paperwork. The confidence that had colored his proposal was gone. In its place was calculation. These were joint decisions, he said. They were joint liabilities, I corrected. I walked him through the breakdown calmly. The initial loan secured with my credit. The capital transfers from my earnings. The equity distributions that excluded my name despite shared funding. You've built something impressive, I continued. But it wasn't built independently. He exhaled slowly. Are you threatening me? No, I said. I'm restructuring reality. The room felt smaller now. The power dynamic once assumed was visibly shifting. If you formalize that engagement, I added, the financial entanglement must be addressed immediately. Equity allocation, liability protection, asset separation. He looked at the watch again, then back at me. You're being cold. I'm being precise. There was a long pause. You wouldn't destroy everything, he said quietly. I'm not here to destroy, I replied. I'm here to correct. The contrast between that office and the restaurant could not have been sharper. No applause. No audience. Just documents and truth. He sat back in his chair, absorbing what the pages implied. The empire he believed he stood alone atop was threaded with my contributions. For years he had spoken about ambition as if it were self-generated. Now he understood its infrastructure. I closed the folder gently. I won't be your silent guarantor anymore, I said. And in that moment the hierarchy of our marriage inverted without a single raised voice. He didn't speak for a long moment. The silence wasn't defensive anymore. It was evaluative. I watched the shift happen behind his eyes, the mental recalculation, the recognition that this wasn't an emotional confrontation, but a structural one. You've already spoken to a lawyer, he said finally. Yes. And if this goes public? It won't, I interrupted. Unless you force it to. That was the difference. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I was interested in protection. He looked down at the documents again, more carefully this time. The numbers weren't abstract anymore. They were risk exposure, shared liability, negotiation leverage. I didn't realize it was this intertwined, he admitted quietly. You didn't need to, I replied. It was convenient not to. Over the next few days I noticed changes. His tone in calls grew more measured. Meetings were rescheduled. His CEO, according to internal chatter I had access to through former colleagues, began distancing herself from certain financial decisions. Risk alters attraction. When the appearance of independence fractures, admiration often follows. He called again 2 days later. We need to restructure, he said. Not we need to fix this. Not we need to talk. Restructure. He understood. The proposal had shifted his romantic allegiance. The documents had shifted his power balance. The hierarchy that once placed him confidently ahead, executive visionary newly engaged, had been recalibrated by something far less theatrical. Paper. Signature. Traceability. For the first time since Valentine's Day I felt no shock. Only confirmation. The applause had been loud. But the realization was louder. The restructuring began quietly. Our attorneys exchanged drafts with the efficiency of people who understood what was at stake. There were no emotional emails, no dramatic ultimatums. Just percentages clauses and revised ownership terms. A portion of his equity was reallocated to reflect documented financial contributions. Certain assets were legally separated to protect my exposure. Liability caps were introduced. Corporate governance tightened. It wasn't punitive. It was corrective. Internally, his board requested additional oversight on financial approvals. Audit protocols were strengthened. The company did not collapse. It adjusted. The engagement was never publicly rescinded, but it was never formally announced again either. The CEO's visibility around him became measured, professional, distant. There was no viral scandal. No social media unraveling. No dramatic confrontation in public spaces. What changed was structural. He no longer spoke about the company as if it were solely his creation. The narrative shifted subtly toward strategic partnerships and shared infrastructure. That language had weight now. We finalized the separation without spectacle. Documents were signed. Accounts divided. Titles clarified. Justice did not look like ruin. It looked like boundaries. Cold, deliberate, enforceable boundaries. And when the dust settled, what remained was not destruction. It was accuracy. Ambition can survive exposure, but it cannot survive denial. The apartment felt different once the paperwork was complete. Not emptier. Clearer. I stood in the bedroom one last time and opened the drawer where I had placed the watch after the restaurant. The engraving caught the light briefly before fading back into shadow. For everything we built. The words no longer felt tragic. They felt accurate. We had built something. Just wasn't permanent. I held the watch in my palm for a moment, then placed it back inside the box and returned it to the drawer. Not as a relic. Not as a wound. As a closed chapter. I didn't need to destroy it to move forward. What ended wasn't my capacity for trust. It was my willingness to be unprotected. When I locked the door behind me for the last time, I didn't look back at the hallway or the framed photographs. I carried only what was mine: documents, personal files, and a steadiness I hadn't possessed years ago. He had chosen ambition over loyalty. I chose structure over emotion. There was no bitterness in the choice. Only alignment. Love can be expansive, reckless, and intoxicating. Can also be blind. Contracts aren't. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer investing in someone else's future. I was protecting my own.